Good afternoon and welcome to VU Echo Talk. I'm Anne-Marie Angebrandt and I'm here today with Celeste Young, who's going to talk about some of her research in the ecology and climate change area. Welcome, Celeste.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, can you describe what climate change is? How do we define climate change?
Climate change is a physical reaction in our climate that's happening to increase levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and what it's doing is creating a heating environment within the sea, which changes weather patterns, which affects everything on the land. But you can't look at that in isolation of other changes that are happening, like we have a huge population. We've got more people on the planet than we've ever had. We've changed the environment we live in. We've got people living in environments they've never lived in before. And digital technology has changed the way we communicate. So all of those things are changing how we operate, and climate change is an amplifier of all of these risks that are now happening.
And I guess emotions are also part of climate change, whether we choose to believe it or not, or how we react to the way the climate is changing. I know some of your research is based around grief and climate change. Can you describe how you put those things together?
Well, it happened quite simply because I was talking to someone in local government and they were saying, look, we have all these people on board with climate change, it's great. Then we went and talked to them about the fact that where they were flooding, they'd have to move their homes, and they got angry with me. And it suddenly struck me that people aren't thinking about what they're actually losing. It suddenly hits them and they have a grief response. I mean, the Great Barrier Reef at the moment, if you look at the public response to that, it's quite profound. And we are losing things. In Australia, we're in the forefront of the impacts that are happening as a result of the increased CO2 levels. And what you're actually seeing now is that the world is changing, and it's not going to go back to what it was. And people have a memory of what it was, and they can't see a positive future. So there is an element of grief, of letting go of that past, so that, and reforming what the future might be, what a livable future looks like for people.
So does your research look at ways of managing that grief, or how does it sort of take grief and recognize it as a concept related to climate change?
Well, it talks about it being an uncomfortable conversation. And I think it's about, we have some choices that we can make up front. And it's really about taking people through that in a controlled way so that it's safe. Because grief, when it's out of control, is quite damaging. And people can get very depressed. You see that in a lot of younger people. They can get quite depressed about the environment or anxious. It's about directing that energy into something that's constructive. And where people have choices, they can make them. Where they don't have choices, they understand they don't. So I think part of understanding grief is understanding the responses, and for people who facilitate those conversations, to help people through that and guide them through that process.
And have you worked directly with some communities in managing grief related to climate change?
Primarily I've been working with government and industry to help them do that with their communities, because it's much more, the way I look at communication is you don't need to go in and do it. Although we have worked with communities, you don't go in and do it directly. What you do is you work through the people who have those connections and the trust, because we're asking people to look at something very difficult and very personal. So we work through the chain, and we train the trainer a lot of the time. A lot of the research is understanding what information they need and doing the research to do that, and then feeding it back in a form through people who actually can communicate it in a way where it's listened, heard and accepted.
Okay, if we just go right back to the beginning, what are some of the reasons that climate change has occurred?
Well, we're a fossil fuel economy. So you've got, I think, if you're looking at it, it is about a lot of people are very invested in continuing to do something that's not particularly constructive, and there haven't been ramifications for them at this point in time, and they're starting to be. I think greed is one of the reasons for climate change. And I think the other aspect of this is that when you're looking at how it's evolved, we've become dependent. We have like a carbon dependency addiction. So it's really weaning ourselves off that addiction and finding new transitional pathways out of that, which is happening at the moment with things like renewable energy and different forms of plastic that people are developing. They're not plastic, they're materials to replace plastic. So we're looking at these new technologies to take us forward.
And your research also discusses continuous change. Can you describe that, continuous change related to climate change?
Well, we've changed things to a point where they're not going to go back to what they were. They will go to a different point, and it's not a judgment of whether it's good or bad. So now that the climate is basically unstable, we don't know exactly what it's going to do. The climate scientists have an idea, but no one's quite sure exactly what's going to happen. So we do know that it's just going to get more extreme. What that means we don't know. So I think it's more about taking those things forward so that people can still make choices.
And what can people do if they are wanting to do something about climate change? What are some practical things they can do to make a difference?
I think you have to look at where you have agency to act. And so I'm a big proponent of the humble action. Small things altogether can make a difference. I think if you're someone in a position of power, you can do more things, you can influence people, you can leverage things. It's where you have agency to make a change, do.
That's fantastic. All right, Celeste Young, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching VU Eco Talk, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.